Amilcar, could you start sharing the presentation so that we have the cover slide up and people will know they're in the right place?
It is time.
Can you see it now?
Yep,
Yeah.
working fine.
Okay, perfect.
So I'll also suggest that we all switch, everyone that's not speaking at the time or presenting, switch off their cameras, I guess. And so that way the person who's speaking and presenting, it comes up on everyone's screen at the top, sort of. Yeah.
Hello, everybody.
Hi, Lorenzo.
Hey, Lorenzo.
Everybody set for this big event?
I hope so.
Good. Let me put my super new screen.
Very nice. Hi, everyone. I just want to say welcome to everybody who's joined us, and we will get started in just about a minute.
All actors.
Well, why don't we, let's get going. So thank you, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the launch of Conservation Trust Fund's 2020 Global Vision, Local Action. This is a project that has been underway for the last 2 years, and we're very excited to be sharing it with you today. I'm Katie Mathias. I'm with the Conservation Finance Alliance Secretariat and the Wildlife Conservation Society, and I'm pleased to see you all. Just a few very quick housekeeping notes. It is helpful if you are not presenting to have both your camera and your microphone off. That just helps us ensure that we don't have background noise. And if you have questions, please do put them into the chat. We'll be having a Q&A session at the end of the 90 minutes, and we will collect the questions from that chat box. So please feel free to enter them at any time. So thanks. Amilcar, if you could advance to the next slide. This project has been made possible by a number of very committed donors, and I want to thank each of them for the contribution that they have made to MAVA Foundation and FM, to the Trillion Trees Initiative, made up of WCS, WWF, and BirdLife, the Global Environment Facility, MG Capital, and Costa Rica por Siempre. All of those have made this project possible, and we are enormously grateful to them. And we'll go to the next slide. The project also came about because of a very committed group of people, the CTF Projects Task Force, who dedicated an enormous amount of their time and their experience and energy to reviewing drafts, to sharing input, to being interviewed and providing content. And we are enormously grateful to them. There are too many to list. Their names are on the screen. A huge round of thanks to them. Also, thank you to the Conservation Finance Alliance's Environmental Funds Working Group, which is the overall sponsor of this project, as well as the Conservation Trust Investment Survey Advisory Committee, who provided input on specific sections. And this project came about through an important partnership with Red Lac and CAFE, and I want to acknowledge that their important contributions as well. The next slide. And perhaps most importantly, I'd like to thank a very committed consulting team from Wolf's Company and Aligning Visions, Amilcar and Viviana, authors of the report, also from Wolf's, Esther Wolf, Kristen Meyer, and Elizabeth Hartman, who have all contributed time and significant input to the report, and from Aligning Visions, Paquita Bath. So thank you to all of you for really stunning commitment and effort and a great work product. So the next slide. In today's agenda for this 90 minutes, we'll hear shortly from donors who made the report possible, who will share why the report was important to them and what they saw as the motivator for sponsoring it. We'll launch the report officially, and then the authors will share highlights from the work. We'll have a panel discussion with several key individuals from the Conservation Trust Fund world, leaders of conservation trust funds, as well as a significant donor who will be able to share their perspectives on the report and how it relates to their experiences. And then we'll have a Q&A session. Back one. Too soon for that one. So let me first introduce Brina Griffin from BirdLife. Brina is the head of the forest programs for BirdLife, as well as the management team representative to the Trillion Trees Initiative. So Brina, let me turn it over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Katie. Can you guys hear me? Yes, I think so.
Yes.
So yeah, I just wanted to say a couple of words about kind of how this all came about. And thinking back, as you said, like 2 years ago to when in my role at BirdLife, and then also with our Trillion Trees colleagues, we started thinking together about sort of this problem of sustaining nature, in particular forests, in the long term, and thinking about, you know, what are the sort of tried and true mechanisms that can be used, as well as some of the newer innovations. And we started thinking about how conservation trust funds really can do both. And we had this idea that they would be an important part of the sort of long-term sustainability for forests generally. But when we started talking to some of the donors that we were working with about conservation trust funds, a lot of them hadn't actually heard about conservation trust funds, or they didn't really understand what they were, how they worked. And we even had one donor who specifically said, do you have any kind of materials on conservation trust funds to kind of tell us how they work? And so then we looked back, and of course that, you know, the last review that had been done was 10 years old at that point. It was the previous 10-year review. And there were some other materials that CFA had produced in that intervening time, but there wasn't really this sort of comprehensive document. And so we reached out to CFA and we started thinking about what we could do, and we realized that you guys were really thinking the same thing. And so we decided to work together to make this happen. And so now 2 years later, we're at this point where, you know, we've had this amazing group of consultants, an amazing task force, and all of these funds have participated. And it's really exciting for us to now be at this launch of this thing that we kind of had in the back of our minds several years ago. So I just want to say a huge thanks to everybody who was part of making this happen, and to the other donors, of course, who contributed. And yeah, really pleased to be here. And I can't wait to share this document and this review with all of those donors who have yet to be converted. That's the next step. So thank you.
Thank you, Brina. That's great. I'd next like to introduce Terry Renaud from the MAVA Foundation. Terry is the Director of Impact and Sustainability for MAVA. MAVA has been not only an important donor to this particular project, but also to the Conservation Finance Alliance overall. So Terry, I turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you, Katie. So conservation trust funds are not dead. Isn't that good news? At MAVA, we are a family foundation, and we have been supporting biodiversity conservation over the last 25 years. And from a donor perspective, the sustainability of what you fund is a key question. You know, you're not donors do not see themselves as funding the same thing for perpetuity. We want to have impact and move. So, and we are a good example at MAVA because we will close our doors in 2022, and all the funding will stop by then. So there needs to be financial mechanisms that can, at some point, take over from philanthropic funding. There are plenty of mechanisms and tools, but developing a good one, a relevant tool, a sustainable conservation finance solution is not that easy. So one of the tools we have at hand is conservation trust funds. And at MAVA, we've been supporting and contributing to conservation trust funds over the past 10 years, and especially in West Africa. Conservation trust funds are not new, but 10 years ago, they were still considered as innovative. But the recent years have been bubbling with all new types of financial mechanisms, new actors, an increasing amount available for impact. And that's really good news for the sector, but somehow it did put conservation trust funds on the back burner. They were not innovative anymore. They might have governance issue. They require huge investment. The financial returns were not good. I mean, we heard so many things. But still, I mean, donors are interested in trust funds. And you might know that AFD and FFEM are in the middle of a major evaluation of their contribution to conservation trust funds. And that will be also very useful for many donors in the sector. So I really welcome this report from CFA. It's very important for me as it sheds a new light on conservation trust funds. And as I said, CTF are not dead. They have a key role in providing a sustainable source of funding for nature conservation. They provide stability in a world which definitely needs some stability. Conservation trust funds are not just endowments. They are developing very innovative conservation finance solutions, and they have a key role in building local capacity. So I'm convinced that the CTF can and are or should play a key role as at the nexus somewhere between public administration, donors, civil society, and the finance sector, and that there are perfect tools to channel money generated by innovative finance mechanisms. So there are many challenges, of course, but many opportunities. So I would like to thank CFA and all the people involved in this report, which is, I think, a major milestone for the sector. And of course, I would like to thank all the conservation trust funds for their effort over the years to provide funding for nature conservation and foster innovation. Thanks.
Terry, thank you, and thank you for your support of this throughout the years, and particularly most recently. I am now going to turn it over, pardon me, to the Executive Director of Conservation Finance Alliance, David Myers, who will lead the actual launch of the report.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you all for joining this very interesting time. We're thrilled about this report. It's clearly one of the most comprehensive reports done on conservation trust funds over the last decade, and the insights. So you'll be hearing a lot of the insights from it as we go to the next phase here. We're going to do this is going to be the official launch of the report. And we are currently uploading it onto the website. My understanding is that it's a large document, so you may end up wanting to wait till we post a smaller, more condensed version in terms of compression. It's I believe 190 pages or something like that, and it's got a huge amount of information, and you're going to just really spend your entire weekend reading it, I'm sure. But what we'd like to do to make the launch official is we're going to, well, first off, I want to point out that the link is there at the bottom of the page that you're seeing there, conservationfinancealliance.org/10-year review with those dashes. And that is where you can come back to. You can go there now, but again, it's just being uploaded, and it may be a bit to download it, but you'll be able to go back there within 24 hours or so, and we'll have a much more streamlined version for you to download. But what we'll do to launch it is I'm going to ask all the authors and all the members of the task force, which again, have spent hours and hours reviewing different versions and providing their contacts and providing their insight. And really, this was such a team effort. And I know Katie's thanked everyone, all the donors and the partners and writers here, but I just want to add a quick thanks to Katie Matthias for really shepherding the entire project forward. It was a commitment and a work of passion here. And I want to thank Kumar as well for doing all the organization to get this webinar up and running. And so what we'd like to do now is we'll shut off the slides. I hope everyone's got that web address down. And we're going to ask all the members of the task force, all the writers, and all the donors, if they would put their camera on. And what we'll do is we'll basically take a big group photo. In fact, anyone who's on, if you want to put your camera on and join the group photo, you're more than welcome to. Very much, interested in trying to get all those members of the task force and all the writers and everyone there. So.
Hola, 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 hola.
Great, excellent. See some great friends and colleagues here. We've got quite a number of folks on here. Not sure how easy it's going to be to take a picture, but if we were at a conference or something like that, we'd be raising a glass here. And so, although it's morning for a lot of us, just want to say congratulations to all. And this is it, the official launch of what was called the 10-year review, now Conservation Trust Funds 2020. And congratulations, everyone. And here we go.
Yay!
Great. Well, thanks everyone. And so now, as part of the program, I think I'm going to pass it to Paquita and Amilcar to do a presentation of the main results, and you'll see that this is some pretty amazing stuff. So over to you, Paquita and Amilcar.
Thank you, David. And thanks everybody for joining the webinar. I'm very happy to be presenting here and to be representing, of course, presenting on behalf of the Wolves Company team, the team that we created for this specific project with Paquita as well. And of course, the task force, Conservation Finance Alliance, etc., and all the people that participated in this report. So it's very exciting to finally see it coming through after 1 year. Or more than 1 year of work and sharing with different people. So I'll start very briefly with some of the methodology, because I think this is one of the key aspects, and then I will hand it over to Paquita to continue with some more findings. So regarding methodology, something that we just really wanted to highlight, you will be able to read more about this in the report, is that it's what makes it a very comprehensive and a very strong source of data for the years to come is that it combines very in-depth quantitative data and qualitative data. So we had a survey that was answered by 50% of the existing CTFs, more or less, which is a very great participation. And we have representation of different continents, different types of conservation trust funds. And this makes it very comprehensive in terms of quantitative data. So just to give you an idea of how in-depth it was, just imagine yourself going through a survey, an online survey of 40 minutes to 1 hour, and how much you can answer and how much information you can share. So this is what these 50 conservation trust funds did. And this is some of the information, or most of the core information that we're sharing here. And to dig deeper into some key subjects, we used, well, many discussions with experts, conservation trust funds, the task force that we had for the project. And that really makes this report richer in terms of stories, in terms of new developments, opportunities, etc. So in parallel to that, we had 2 studies that we used as well to collect some findings. One was the master's thesis conducted by Elizabeth Hartman that was mentioned before. And that went through more than 300 annual and evaluation reports of conservation trust funds. So that also provided some quantitative data. And then the multi-year study of the Conservation Trust Investment Survey, which I won't explain now because Katie will present some results, but also provided very, very comprehensive data on investment performance. So after this, it is very well possible that if you're watching this webinar, you were probably part of the study one way or the other. You either participated in the survey, perhaps you were interviewed, and maybe you will see some of your input reflected in the slides that we'll share with you today. And we hope that you will see it well reflected as well in the report, of course. So I'll hand it over to Paquita for her to describe some of the first findings.
Okay, we had the pleasure of following up on the work of Philip Taib and Barry Spergel, who did the last 10-year review. So since that time, what we found is there are 40 new CTFs since the time they did their report, showing that it's a continuing growing movement. More and more countries are interested in having conservation trust funds for a variety of reasons, and they're quickly expanding. And there's more still in process that are not mentioned in those 40. There are now 108 conservation trust funds worldwide. So that's been very exciting to see that many now collaborating through the networks and individually. Some of you are now 20 to 30 years old. Ilkar, could you keep up the slides? Some of them are now 20 to 30 years old. And it's just amazing to me that, you know, we used to think of these as just such new organizations. And some of you are celebrating some serious anniversaries and bring an enormous amount of experience and knowledge and commitment to show for that. I think some of these older conservation trust funds have really inspired this next generation, and it's one of the really exciting things to see how much support there has been. Also, we found, and it was harder to track this, 14 conservation trust funds that had closed over the years, either because of poor management, because they chose to merge with another one, issues with funding, et cetera. So, you know, they're not all 100% moving forward, but 14 have closed during this period. So what we were looking at were what were the enabling conditions that have enabled some of these trust funds to be so effective. Not surprisingly, committed and leadership that's got incredible connections at the government level and at the international and local level has been key. Leadership is always important with any startup organization, but in this case, the boards and executive directors who have had that capacity to link different types of donors, local community members, community-based organizations, and obviously good ties with the government have been critical. A number of groups have had really strong donor sponsor startup, and that has been key to giving them the kind of endowments and the kind of initial support that have made them successful over the long term. One of the interesting findings was that national governments tended to support about 50% of startup organizations, but only supported about 15% of conservation trust funds once they were up and going. So a real message to those of you in the startup phase to make sure you get your national government on board at this point. One of the other findings was that some of the founding documents of some of the organizations that closed tended to be very specific, either limiting them to one program account or limiting them geographically. And those trust funds spent, just like everybody else, a lot of time and effort into institutional development that then ultimately had to close down when they couldn't expand beyond that specific geography or specific area. The endowments have just provided this incredible sense of resiliency in supporting the operating cost of many of the truly effective conservation trust funds. It's allowed them to innovate. If you don't have enough money to worry about constantly covering staff costs, et cetera, you're certainly not about to start investing in new types of financial mechanisms. And the organizations that had that stability have really shown incredible ability to innovate and to bring in far more money than the initial endowment. And finally, we really make the case in this book about conservation trust funds having the special niche of linking organizational landscapes, both the international donors, national government agencies, and the local community groups. And there's that knowledge and ability to facilitate and coordinate all of these different stakeholders that has proven to be one of their incredible niche abilities. So when these enabling conditions are in place, the groups then have the ability to really build trust among their donors and with the groups that they're funding. So they build the trust by becoming essential institutions. And by essential institutions, I mean, these are not just nonprofits that come and go. They have been here now 20 to 30 years. They have a seat at the table because they bring resources to bear. The practice standards for conservation trust funds that Kathy Mickerton and Barry Spergel worked on was really an incredible piece of work, thanks to many people, including the task force at the time. But that provided a transparent way for the conservation trust funds to recognize how to behave, how to administer their funds, how to be transparent. And it really has affected the whole community, helping to raise the level of practice across the community. That's just been updated because obviously over a 10-year period, you're seeing more and more needs for conservation trust funds as well. Conservation trust funds have, that are doing very well, have very fast administrative response capacity. We've included a few examples of how trust funds just in the last few months with the COVID hitting us and everybody's lives and all of our grantees' lives and the people on the ground's lives have changed, and how some of them have been able to just very quickly respond to try to address the incredible emergency in some of these areas. We've often talked about the importance of independence of trust funds during government transitions and this ability to partner well over the long term. So these are the ways in which conservation trust funds have really built trust over time. And so now we want to share with you some of the more quantitative findings, and I'll turn it back to Amilcar for that.
Thank you, Paquita. So to share some of the more quantitative findings from especially from the survey of CTFs, here we wanted to start with some of the new developments or how the programs of conservation trust funds have evolved. And with the programs, we refer to the conservation programs that they support. And there are different types of programs that go from more nature-based or nature-oriented actions, so direct management, to other type of programs that probably cover more holistic actions or perhaps education, awareness, etc. So we have seen that conservation trust funds over the last 10 years have built on lessons learned and have built on what has happened with the entire conservation community. And that there was, of course, the realization that some ecosystems were largely ignored in the past, and some actions in these ecosystems were not enough. And a good example is marine and coastal ecosystems. So marine pollution, degradation of coral reefs, etc. Those were some issues that were not really being paid enough attention. And so conservation trust funds really moved towards marine and coastal systems, and they have started to develop some strong programs. There are some conservation trust funds that have been created specifically for to cover the needs of marine environments. We have from global conservation trust funds like the Blue Action Fund to regional initiatives like Pacifico, or to other regional conservation trust funds like the Met Fund, for example. And all this, and this is one area. And then also in terms of some other ecosystems that were not really being considered, we found the areas outside protected areas. So conservation trust funds started really focusing on protected areas and the management of protected areas. And this has also switched towards other areas that are actually have other types of uses. So that's one development, that they have expanded their scope to towards some ecosystems or areas that were not really addressed in the past or not enough. And then the other major development has been that they have started to invest more and more in the context that supports the conservation actions that the conservation trust funds fund. And here we have just three very brief examples that we have chosen just to highlight in this presentation. And one is building capacities, especially of local partners that need to be able to absorb the funding that they receive and implement the right actions in an effective manner. So conservation trust funds are building capacities among their partners. Then in relation to policies, conservation trust funds are also getting more involved in policy discussions to make sure that there are no subsidies or at least that there are changes in subsidies or policies that promote or support overexploitation or degradation of ecosystems, for example. And then finally, something that many of you probably know is that they have started to invest more and more in livelihoods and sustainable livelihoods and minimizing some impacts. And so in summary, conservation trust funds have moved beyond or outside their comfort zones of protected areas and especially terrestrial areas to engaging with a broader and wider community of practitioners on the ground, but also with decision makers at the national levels and even at the international level as well. However, this expansion of in the scope of action of conservation trust funds, of course, needs some funding. And conservation trust funds are institutions that by definition build financial resilience, or that's their intention. And well, where does all this funding, so all these figures that we are presenting on the screen come from? They have historically come mainly from multilateral organizations and bilateral organizations who were the main responsible for the creation of the first conservation trust funds. And they have started and they have continued providing support to conservation trust funds over the years. And this decade, the last decade, was not the exception. So many of the additional funds that existing conservation trust funds received came from these multilateral or bilateral organizations, but also, as Paquita already mentioned, national governments have become more and more important. Now, something that we can also highlight is the role that private foundations have started to play. So we have a welcoming message from MAVA Foundation, but we also have many European, with MAVA is of course European, and we have also many private foundations based in the United States who have provided very stable support to conservation trust funds, in many cases also to help them capitalize endowments or sinking funds. So the diversity of donors has increased, and with that the level of sophistication has also become higher in terms of programs, in terms of specific interest in specific themes or geographies, etc. And one type of organization that has been fundamental to help articulate all these efforts is are the international NGOs. So the big international NGOs have played a role in leveraging resources by providing initial funding, but also articulating effort by many of these different donors. And of course, the major, for those who are familiar with this type of funding, this goes from very local levels to very large scale investments. And in that, as an example of that, we have the project finance for permanence, which of course targets more complex projects that require commitment from many different types of donors and over long periods of time. So it's a single closing contract that secures this funding for a large number of years. So this is what we can see in terms of funding sources. In the report, you will find a number of different, more specific charts and more complex as well. That we don't want to overwhelm you with that. But then the other side of the equation is how all this funding has been mobilized. And conservation trust funds have used many different mechanisms, although the core mechanism for them has been donations. Many conservation trust funds were created through donations based on donations to endowment funds or sinking funds. 90% of conservation trust funds at the moment have, or more than 90%, I would say, have endowment funds. And over the last decades, 80% were, as you can see in the chart here. And this chart, if you're watching this on the phone, maybe it's not big enough. So you can trust what I'm saying. But you can see at the bottom of the chart that donations of endowment funds were used by 80% of conservation trust funds. So they were successful in obtaining these donations and motivating donors to give money to their endowments. And this, the key to the success is that they have shown, so conservation trust funds have shown that the endowments have been essential for them to help them grow, to institutionalize important programs, and also to gain credibility among decision makers and get the seat at the table that Paquita was mentioning before. So to capitalize endowments, another important mechanism is the debt conversions, and many of these debt conversions over the last decade took place in the context of the US Tropical Forest Conservation Act agreements. So they were debt for nature swaps, as in previous decades. In addition to that, conservation trust funds have also, we see a trend in raising other types of funds through flow-through funds, so the administration of grants for third parties. And other than that, there are a number of other mechanisms that conservation trust funds have tried or have explored. However, something we see here is that none of them has become mainstream. So some CTFs have tried one option, some CTFs have tried other options, but none of them has become a solution for all CTFs or an alternative to donations and some traditional mechanisms. Now, this of course doesn't mean that the fund generation potential of these mechanisms is not enough, but tells much more about how context specific these mechanisms are. And in many cases, they are they can generate large amounts of funds for some conservation trust funds, while not being even feasible for some other conservation trust funds. However, this does not stop conservation trust funds from considering these options. And in this chart, we can see what conservation trust funds are considering or have considered to implement in the future. And you can see the dark bars are the mechanisms represent the number of conservation trust funds that are looking into these different mechanisms for the future. And we see a diversity of different mechanisms. Maybe this chart doesn't present a specific trend. So this is one of the findings that we have complemented with additional consultations. But we can see that something that many experts and conservation trust funds agree on is the importance of some partnerships, the interest in some economic instruments, market instruments to start mobilizing additional funds, and the interest in many conservation trust funds in becoming more and more involved in impact investments by providing the risking instrument to leverage further support. Then, as I was speaking just before, this was on the side of the equation where we see the fund generation for the conservation trust funds, and that they can then deploy to conservation actions on the ground. And conservation trust funds also use different instruments to do that. And the main instrument over time has been, of course, grants and other transfers. And we look, and we can see in this chart following the same structure as the previous chart. So what we had in the last 10 years and what we will have in the future, we can see that there is an interest among conservation trust funds in moving from small project-specific grants, which were very common over the last 10 years, towards larger and larger grants and over longer periods of time. So those are the grants that are shown at the bottom. And then again, there is an increasing interest in diversification. And here we see that two key aspects for that are partnerships and innovation. And diversification, as expressed by many of the conservation trust funds we spoke with, has to do with expanding and scaling the impacts of the grants that they make. So they have realized, many conservation trust funds have realized that in order to expand their scope, to be able to cover all these new programs that they are covering since a few years ago, they need to look into more innovative mechanisms to complement the funding that they can provide through grants. So these are some of the options. Of course, we have further details in the report. And then to complete the whole story about financial resilience, of course, a very important aspect is asset management. So how conservation trust funds are performing in their investments. And I will let Katie present that because she has a very good database based on 13 years of data and collecting data. So I hand it over to you, Katie.
Thank you, Amilcar. So yes, as Amilcar said, the Conservation Trust Investment Survey has been collecting data on investment management practices and results of conservation trust funds for the last 13 years. There are 61 conservation trust funds that have provided data at some point, or in some cases over all 13 of those years. And it gives us a robust database that we can use to look for trends and outcomes. So we in particular, and this is what I'm going to share with you today, and what's in the report is a subset of a larger study that we're putting together. But in particular, what we wanted to look at is how does that investment performance compare to the CTF community's expectations? How does it compare to external benchmarks? And how do the CTFs compare to each other? So those were the operating questions that we started with. We looked particularly at the real returns of endowments. So as Amilcar said, I think it's something like 90% of trust funds are initiated with an endowment, 80% of them added to endowments over the last 10 years. They're a critical piece of the funding model for CTFs. And particularly because endowments are anticipated or planned with the goal of investing in perpetuity, inflation is a critical consideration. And so looking at real returns, the returns after inflation, are particularly important. And what we found is that on the whole, the endowments are generally underperforming, both against expectations and against external benchmarks. But within that, there are some success stories of top performers who are demonstrating really solid returns over time. And so it is entirely possible for the CTF to achieve those results in a long-term period. So to do this, one thing that we wanted to look at is 4 sort of hypothetical portfolios. Amilcar, if you could add the next animation. We looked at 2 portfolios that were based on benchmarks. One was a portfolio that was 60% equities and 40% global bonds. A second one that was 50% global equities, 45% global bonds, and 5% cash. And then we looked at the CTF that had the median performance over that 13-year period and the CTF that had the 75th percentile performance. So again, the CTF where 50% of the CTFs did better and 50% of the endowments did worse over the entire 13-year period. We started with the idea that each of those portfolios started with $10 million in 2006 at the start of our data. And we said, what happens if they spent 3% a year on conservation, given the returns that they earned? And you can see what happened. Amaka, if you could hit the next, just one more animation, thanks. So after that 13-year period, the CTF endowments lost value in real terms. The benchmarks did not. So at the end of 13 years, accounting for inflation, the benchmark portfolios were still about 10 million in real terms. The CTF endowments had declined in some cases to by $3.5 million in real terms. Over that same time period, the benchmark portfolios could have spent between about $4.5 million on conservation over 13 years. The CTF portfolios, the two comparative endowment portfolios, could have spent about 3.6 million, again, spending at 3% per year. So what that tells us is that, again, the green line represents the portfolio where 50% of the CTFs did better and 50% did worse. And there is a pretty large gap between that line and those reference benchmark portfolios. The 75th percentile fund was not appreciably better. So there are certainly some concerns about whether CTFs are meeting the expectation that the conservation trust fund community has had, that endowments will be able to generate spending in the 3 to 4% range over time. We're seeing that that's not happening at the median, and that those endowments will hold their value in real terms in perpetuity. So if we could go to the next slide. Again, I said we were going to look at the endowments in three contexts: in relative to expectations, relative to external benchmarks, and relative to each other. So relative to that expectation, again, that CTFs could spend from their endowments 3 to 4% per year, we found that 14 of the 67 endowments that we had data for achieved a real return compound annual growth rate of 3.1% or above. That's essentially the rate that would allow them to spend 3% per year and still maintain their value in real terms. 15 endowments met or exceeded the benchmark that was 50% global equities, 45% global bonds, and 5% cash, at least 60% of the time. And 4 of those met that benchmark or exceeded it 70% of the time. And compared to each other, there really were only 3 endowments that were consistently in the top 2 quartiles of their peers every year. So it gives us an interesting picture that there are top performers who are consistently performing well, and we need to understand what is it about them that makes them able to do that. So we can add the next half of this slide. The things that they have in common were asset allocations that were 50 to 60% equities. And for those of you who have been reading the CTIS over the years, you'll see that typically the average asset allocation of the CTFs tends to be more like 30% equities, again, on average. But the top performers we're seeing with 50 to 60% of their portfolios directed towards equities, some use of alternatives, minimal cash, and only 20 to 30% of their portfolio in fixed income or bonds. Those portfolios tended to be held in hard currencies, typically dollars or euros, but there are a few other hard currencies being used. They use external professional investment advisors. So they're relying on advice from well-known and well-established professional advisors. And they have globally diversified portfolios. So they're not overly relying on investments in their own country or even in their own region. They're looking for ways to diversify across the entire array of investment options that are available to them. So I just want to quickly highlight that the benchmark portfolios that I shared and the asset allocation that seemed to do well over that 13-year period is the asset allocation that worked for that period. It's not necessarily a prediction that that's what's going to work going forward, but that is where the use of really well-qualified external professional investment advisors comes into play. The ability to really model out using economic projections and macroeconomic data and running simulations to really understand what portfolio is going to be most successful at meeting the CTF's investment needs. So as I said, there will be more data in a forthcoming report, but I'll hand it back to Amilcar and Paquita for other findings.
Thank you, Katie. So as you can see, we have a huge amount of quantitative data thanks to the hard work of the survey and the CTIS and all of these things coming together. And we've provided a lot of areas where we think CTFs can improve over time, including obviously the investment piece. But some of our larger conclusions, looking back at the overall set of the data, is that this obviously is a growing sector with 40 new CTFs and at least 5 more that we're aware of currently forming. We know that the practice standards have been incredibly well received and have been widely used across the whole sectors. We know that more and more CTFs are working with sustainable development goals at this point and are really committed to having greater balance with human ecosystem, human well-being and ecosystem health. That's another area that we've pointed out as an area for greater improvement because CTFs, like so many conservation organizations, are still struggling with providing really good impact measures, especially measures that we can use across the sectors. And as we do more work with the UN Sustainable Development Goals and other types of international areas, we definitely want to see much greater monitoring and evaluation on the part of the conservation trust funds. The endowments have been a really important anchor of stable capital, and those who have been managing endowments well have really been able to spur innovation. The niche for conservation trust funds has been this ability to link global priorities with effective local investments, and you're seeing more and more of them, as Amilcar discussed, working in capacity building and other ways to make those local investments it's more and more impactful as we go forward. And the really high performers in this community are doing a lot more work now with private sector engagement. Many of them are getting accredited with the Global Climate Facility, with the Global Environmental Fund, Global Environment Facility, a lot of different accreditation opportunities out there that these organizations are jumping on. And they're using more and more new financial mechanisms. I think Amilcar really showed the bar of how many are now moving in that direction after many years of relying strictly on grants. So going forward, one of the things that we're seeing is this greater and greater commitment. It's grown enormously over the last 10 years, but now there's been this huge commitment to having greater investment in local communities. As we know, the current crises are interdependent: biodiversity loss, climate change, ecosystem degradation, and all of these are having a huge impact on human well-being, human migration. And so we're seeing the Conservation Trust Fund community really investing increasingly in these areas. And finally, as we look forward, especially with this COVID crisis, kind of what are the current major challenges and opportunities facing all of us? Almost all the countries that we're working with the COVID crisis are seeing increased debt. We've been very fortunate that the Tropical Forest Conservation Act, now the Tropical Forest and Coral Reef Conservation Act, has been reauthorized in the United States. And the European have been getting more and more involved in debt solutions. So we're seeing the debt crisis is potentially being a real opportunity for conservation trust funds to be more engaged at the national level on that front. Many countries are already talking about how they're going to spend their way out of the economic crisis and the unemployment crisis in their countries, and oftentimes that's with infrastructure investments. So the extent that conservation trust funds can help mainstream and work on the policy part of how that infrastructure gets redeveloped is just a huge opportunity for all of us right now. Many of the conservation trust funds that we interviewed indicated that compensation and offset mechanisms are definitely growing in their countries, and there's an increasing need and opportunity there for them to help manage those funds and to really work on improving that aspect of both the funding side to conservation, as well as the improving the government policies around what types of development should be supported. Again, the front runners, the progressive conservation trust funds are working increasingly on transforming whole agricultural economies, both in fisheries and agriculture. But how we're building our food as we go forward is obviously one of the biggest issues conservation-wise across the world. It's no longer just about protected areas. It's about how do we really look at how this is affecting us in so many ways. And the new financial mechanisms that we're using are giving a real opportunity to work better with the private sector in these economies and really engage with them. It's very, very slight at this point, but I'm hoping that in 10 years' time, when the next group does the review, that we're seeing more and more conservation trust funds truly investing in micro enterprises, small and medium enterprises, helping to incubate some of the technologies that we desperately need for pollution control, for plastics management, seeing more and more of them getting increasingly interested in this, helping to work with banks to provide subsidies for more effective grazing practices, this type of thing, which is a really big change in the way that conservation trust funds have traditionally been managed. So very exciting new opportunities there. And we've already made the case that this integration of ecosystem conservation and human well-being is increasingly driving conservation trust funds going forward. As we look to the future and how international commitments, Paris Accords, et cetera, can move forward, this is one of the best opportunities to say, hey, rather than having to create special vehicles for managing these funds, here's one of the major solutions where conservation trust funds are effective and where they're well established. We can help to move some of these multilateral funding and national commitments into really good programs on the ground. So big opportunities here. And finally, I just wanted to say that we've done a series of case studies, and I'm so grateful to the conservation trust funds that were willing to work with us on these case studies. I think they're actually, I know it sounds braggy, but they're very good. And I'll just turn it over now to the panel, because that includes two leaders of organizations that were part of these case studies. So I think we can all learn a lot from these. So thank you so much. Myself and Amilcar and Katie and Vivian, who is another important co-author, will be available for questions after the panel. So I'll turn it over to David to introduce the panelists.
Thank you so much, Paquita and Amilcar. Really, what a great report, great presentation. I was going to say in my introduction to the panelists that these case studies themselves are, quite substantial reports in and of themselves. So I do recommend that you take your time and look through them. Today, we were going to have some introductory remarks from each of the panelists, and then we'll go to some question and answer, and we'll at that point open it up to questions from the audience and invite all the authors and to join and respond to some of the questions as well. So I'm going to just move things forward as fast as I can. Very excited to have three panelists today: Scott Lampman, Executive Director of the Tropical Forestry and Coral Reef Conservation Act Secretariat, which is at the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. Natalia Arango, the Executive Director of Fondo Acción, who's been with the Fondo Acción for over a decade now. And Sean Nazarelli, who is the Director of Innovative Finance for Biofund in Mozambique. Both Fondo Acción and Biofund were two of the case studies, two of the 5 case studies. And we'll start with you, Scott. Some introductory remarks. You bring a huge perspective to this. Would love to hear your thoughts.
Can I be seen and heard right now?
Well, if we can remove the slideshow,
David, can
you'll be able to be seen better. But we hear you, but I don't see your screen. I don't see you. There you go.
You don't see me.
Now I see
Well, as
you.
long as you can
Now we
hear me,
can.
I think that's the more important part. Yeah, first of all, the exciting part of this panel are the next 2 speakers. So I want to try to be as brief as possible here. Thanks. First of all, congratulations to the authors and the contributors and the sponsors for what I think is a really powerful and useful and an authentic rendering of a great story of CTFs over the past 10 years. And I'm honored just to have a moment to speak about some historical perspective here. The objective, as noted in the document, is to do a 10-year retrospective and to document the evolution of the funds and to provide all actors, including donors, by the way, with improved effectiveness and impacts of the CTFs and their prospective future. So if you look at the table of contents for this document, it really reflects the full comprehensive effort to address this objective. And as has been mentioned, a rich portion of the document are the case studies themselves and actually the resources in the annexes. So this is a rich document and it's a tremendous contribution to the community of environmental funds. It was interesting that the task force, as we were looking at this late in the process, said, is this a marketing document? And in fact, I just like to say, I think it actually is kind of hard hitting in a couple of areas that certainly have already been mentioned. The time that Katie talked about the fiduciary responsibility of the boards and their investment performance over the years, and it really has not been what it perhaps should have been. And the other aspect are the conservation impacts. We always talk about not being able to monitor and report our impacts as well as we should. And I think this is still part of our future. We're still not doing it very well as a community. And I think that the document hits up this pretty hard as well. From my brief historical perspective, I just wanted to address a simple portion of this, which continues on these challenges that the fund have. On page 30 of the document, it talks about enabling factors for success and challenges. Paquita addressed the successful funds quite well on what enabling factors are. But in terms of the closing funds, and closure is not failure because a lot of them are designed as sinking funds, so they would close. An impressive fact is that a number of them actually recapitalized, found additional financing, and then a number of them are retooled for a transition to become a fund for a different theme like health. So those are success stories in their own right. And I'd also say from a donor's perspective that a number of the funds are disadvantaged from the start when they need to close. For instance, their capitalization was just too small from the get-go, or quite frankly, a number of the countries just are lesser endowed in terms of their natural resources. So they don't have the sexy, charismatic fauna that attracts a lot of donor dollars. So if you don't have some of those factors that are just kind of innate, then you're really behind the learning curve here. Now, in terms of the donors, again, I'm speaking as a donor, we oftentimes need to learn ourselves to design these CTFs without as many constraints, flexibility, and be able to amend the documents. That has to be addressed. And quite frankly, the lack of open vision, it seems like we don't often bring that to the table when we first negotiate these agreements. And then finally, a handicap can be the legal structure in its own right. Some countries, civil law, common law, executive decrees, legislative mandates establish these CTFs in a very different fashion. And as we know, they're not homogeneous entities. They're very different. I'd also mention that when we say the new practice standards were referenced here, there are 4 new areas to the practice standards, and all of them essentially address CTF management. Human resource management, communications, technology, risk management. All of this is around strengthening the institution. So as we're looking to the future here, as this document does, it's really a crosswalk between the enabling conditions for strengthening the institution and knowing its risk appetite, knowing its real costs and its institutional capacity. It's the trade-off or the crosswalk between this relative to the diversity and the types of mechanisms for sourcing the money and deploying the money. I think that's been addressed quite well by the speakers and the document itself. And in some ways, I envision that as being the next step for a CFA document or publication is there's prudent expectations on this continuum of capabilities and mission statements for the funds. And if they're going to move to the next step, they really have to have an understanding of what's going to get them there. This document by and large, and that's great. And then lastly, not all the funds are going to be certified by global carbon funds or even called to be incubators of small business enterprises. So it's really the board knowing itself and its capabilities as mission statement. And in my belief, the traditional grant making is always going to be a foundation of most of these funds, and we still have to do that well. So my last word is we see that success often begets success. And it's great to have the networks like CFA and REDLAC and CAFE and AppNet who are supporting the furtherance of this important conservation mission. So congratulations to all, and thanks for the brief word.
Thank you, Scott. Yeah, really some great points there. Just because we're running out of time, I'm not going to hit you with a question right away. I'm going to move on to Natalia Arango, who is the Executive Director of Fondo Acción in Colombia. And as I mentioned before, as Natalia gets her slides ready, this is one of the case studies, and one of the challenges is getting to some of this innovation that we talked about. So Natalia, over to you.
Thank you, David. Can you hear me? Can you see my screen?
Perfect. Both are good.
Well, thanks. I want to say thank you to CFA, to Katie, to the task force, not only for including and selecting Fondo Acción as a case study for this important document, but also for inviting us to this exciting event. I just want to take a couple of minutes to describe who we are, because we have over 100 participants in this event. Fondo Acción is a Colombian trust fund created in year 2000 to operate a conservation debt for nature swap between the US and Colombia. And we've been investing in environment and childhood since the onset. And if I have to reflect on three things that this audience can take home about Fondo Acción, is our emphasis on sustainable financing, integrating all components of society into conservation and protection of children's rights, and an emphasis on accountability and effective and efficient performance. Being a CTF in a developing country, you need to realize, and include in everything you do, that you need to promote sustainable territories if you want to achieve conservation. And that means working with the people who live in the territories and who are ultimately the stewards of the natural areas and the people responsible for healthy communities. That's all I wanted to say about Fondo Acción. I am very excited about the document. I've been trying to summarize what it means to us, and I would try to do it with three main values. I would say the recap of the history of CTFs is always useful. Seeing and being able to briefly understand the evolution of us as a community is very informative. But it's also inspirational. This document, as others in the past, is a very important source of new ideas for solving common problems, or even learning how to innovate in strategies. So as before, this is one of the richness of this document. And I would just summarize sort of the general feeling by saying it's a very important tool for reinforcing a sense of community, and a sense of community for organizations from civil society who have to face very challenging endeavors like protecting the environment and children is a very important asset, and we value it very much. I think that's all I want to say as an introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. Really appreciate it. I want to come back to you after Sean and pose a question on innovation and how you do start to address some of these potential private sector opportunities. So be prepared for that. But I'm going to move on to Sean right now. Sean Nazarelli is the Director of Innovative Finance for BioFund in Mozambique. And BioFund is a relatively new fund, and but they've managed to do make some amazing progress in the time that they've been established. Sean, over to you. Can't quite hear you just yet.
Okay, can you hear me now and see my screen?
Yes, now we can. Perfect.
Okay, great. Thanks. And thanks very much, David. And thanks very much, CFA. I think these kind of documents really help justify our existence. They really help show the added value that trust funds have around the globe. And funds like this kind of experience and accumulation of experience that really helps us in our work and our getting off to a good start. So let me just introduce here as a case study of a new fund. So let me just tell you very briefly. BioFund is
Sean, maybe
in Mozambique.
Turn your camera off. Turn your camera off because then the sound quality will improve. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay, can you hear me better now?
Much better, thanks.
Excellent. Okay. Yes, we're in Mozambique where the internet is not wonderful, but we were founded in exactly we are interested because we have a we have a membership institution. So we have 50 members of all the institutions that are involved in conservation, along with a lot of very key individuals involved in this for many years. We structured ourselves in a way to really focus on 3 key pillars, which first one is consolidating BioFund as a new institution. We really focused on that. We had to have a strong institution. Beyond just financing to creating an enabling environment. And so we developed a 3rd strategic pillar to create an environment promote that kind of idea for conservation in a country. I'm not going to go through the whole chronogram, but I think what's interesting about this, because the case study was sort of look at the different kind of phases in how we got around and how we became, how we created. Funding committee and creating the base conditions, the first set of statutes, the people who are going to run it. That took another 2 years with a bit of facilitation from WWF and some funding from AFD and KFW for that. And then the fund was created. It then spent probably around 4 years doing the startup and the initial fundraising during that period to be able to start able to do and large growth since then. So this is just a little bit of the growth. We've grown from sort of 4 in 2014 through 6 in 2016. Now we're up 18 actually in 2020. We're now over 20 people working in the foundation. The endowment has grown regularly and well. We have managed to effectively beat inflation, and really, I think our investment policy now also stipulates that we should have between 60 and 70% of our money in stocks, which helps to meet those targets that Katie was talking about a little earlier. We have a large of flow-through projects where we have money to implement. We have and also direct implementation projects, both on technical assistance to build the foundation itself, but also things like highlighted education for research in the area, fundraising
Sean, it's very hard to hear you. There's a lot of breaking up there. So maybe if you could wind up the presentation, we can get to
Yep.
some questions.
Okay. So that's that's who we are, and I hope that that's a lesson really of being able to deliver on that. How to work, how to put things together, and maybe use a recent that's on we're doing we're hearing best practices, and I think that's been key to our success here. Using the experience all you created and us over the years. So thanks.
Thank you, Sean. I'm really sorry that the sound quality was very difficult there. Unfortunately, we were not able to hear everything you had to say, which is a shame because I really wanted to hear it, but maybe we'll get a chance in some of the questions. So I'm going to just move forward. We only have about 15 minutes left. I want to get to some of the questions that are being asked on the chat, and we'll probably ask Katie to help me out with that. But first off, just a question for the panel. You know, one of the things that strikes me with this report was this forward thing. So first off, you know, for me, one of the big conclusions is that conservation trust funds are not just a fund managing money. They are institutions. They're institutions that are focused on conservation finance and developing and expanding their capacity with using conservation finance tools to achieve conservation outcomes. And what struck me from the report was that in the future, you know, there's a lot of hope in the future that some of these more innovative solutions will become part of the both funding source for the trust funds and the ways in which they spend the money. And I want to come back to you, Natalia, just real quickly, just to ask you how, you know, and this was a question that came up, you know, are these concrete plans that the trust funds have, do you think, or in your case, do you have, or are they just is it wishful thinking to try to expand and diversify the use of finance tools?
It is reality. If you have the chance to, not you, but the people who are receiving the report today, go through our case study, you can see it's a gradual getting to know the private sector and considering private sector from the individual landowner to big enterprises and corporations. So in our case, we have been building gradually in the interaction with the private sector, and not only considering them a donor, which of course they are, but getting to know them as a partner where they find support and the services that they need to perform their job and to comply with regulations in the best way they can. So it's not wishful thinking. There are realities. I would say the most impressive of those realities in our case are the carbon markets, and how, as a result of a tax imposed by the Colombian government on green gas emissions from fossil fuels, a whole national market, a voluntary market from my perspective, because people who are responsible for the task can choose to pay the tax, or they can choose to go to projects and acquire credits, carbon credits, to reduce the amount of money they pay according for their tax. So it's a voluntary decision, but it is a win-win. We represent projects. We represent currently 9 projects that are selling their credits to all of the companies that are interested in reducing their tax related to the green gas emissions. So they're benefiting from a business perspective, and they're benefiting the communities who have produced these or have certified these credits as a result of their conservation efforts. So by no means they are plans, they are realities, and they are evolving and growing like the offset environment. It is a very much competed environment because it's a very interesting source for the collaboration of other sectors, of other private sectors, consultants. So they create a more competitive environment, which is good and healthy, because then we have to be there and be preparing and producing services that are up to speed with a more competitive environment.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Yeah, no, it's very exciting, some of the innovations and sort of the program related investments that the trust funds are starting to think about, mimicking the evolution of some of these innovative approaches for in foundations, for example, in the US. Great. Well, I'd like to get to some of these questions here on the that people have put in. And the way we usually do this is if you've written up a question that we think will fit in, we'll ask you to unmute your microphone. You can put your camera on as well if you'd like, and you can ask the question directly. We had Ralph Cadle asking a question here. Ralph, do you want to unmute your microphone and ask your question if you're still on? And maybe Katie, you can pull out one or two other questions here. Otherwise, maybe just in the meantime, let me just ask Scott and Sean here as well. One of you, how do you find like the right balance between trying to be extremely innovative and then just getting all the basics down? I mean, Katie had mentioned the challenge with making sure your investments are, approaching at least the indices that sort of almost blind investing should result in, or at least a well-managed portfolio, diversified portfolio. How do you balance innovation versus getting the block and tackle, the basic part correct? Scott, maybe if you want to.
David, sure, can you hear me? I'll try to be real brief here. First of all, I just commend to you the case study in Colombia, because Natalia is there. She's a little bit modest on this, but it's a real fantastic case study to say there's an opportunity with the private sector. How did the institution respond? So it's that balance and the board vision for what you had to do to accommodate those new innovative opportunities. And then secondly, I just say I'm on a task force for risk management and how it applies to the conservation trust funds. And once again, not all trust funds are supposed to be the gold standard of World Bank performance standards. So we're trying to find that balance right within what are the steps and what are the capabilities required to move from each, and when do you have to move? Not just how do you move, but do you need to move? So that's part of the question, the answer there. Back to Sean.
Yeah, David, if I would just say a few things there, I would say, look, the basics are the fundamentals and they're the most important thing to get right. But really, there's such a wealth of experience out there that it's pretty well shaped now with the work that you guys have been doing at CFA and others here many people in this gathering here have been the people that BioFund learned from. Melissa Moy, Ralph Cadle, yourselves, Ray Victorine, and a huge big shout out to Funbiu, have shown BioFund how to do the basics right. And all that accumulated experience has allowed us to avoid a lot of the mistakes that were made by others and to really get a huge leg up or a huge jump forward in getting those basics. With that done, then you can start to think about innovation. You can start thinking about doing things new and different. Get the basics right, because that's where most of your money is going to come from. And for that, there's really good blueprints.
Excellent, Sean. Yeah, so great point. In the practice standards that was recently released, the update again with an amazing consulting team of Paquita and Viviana and everyone. And Almacar, it's a fantastic document, and I'm sure that'll be great guidance going forward. Okay, so there was.
David, Ralph is up if you want to have him pose his question.
Okay, Ralph, if you could unmute yourself, that would be great.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this wonderful study. I'm very keen to read it, despite the fact it's a very huge paper. That's number one. Number two, Jean-Paul Paddock is coming late as always, and for this time being under my name. This is exciting. My question was, did you look a little bit deeper in the responsible investment aspect for the assets, and what has been the outcome for that? Because in KfW, we had always struggled to convince our financial people to go only for responsible investments, and every success story would be highly, highly welcome on our side. Thank you.
Thank you, Ralph.
David, shall I get that one? I already answered to Ralph on the chat, but so that everybody can get the same response. Yeah. So what we have a section on the report where we highlight ESG or responsible investment as a trend, and we cite some reports that have come out this year explaining why this is actually becoming more widespread or mainstream, because it's no longer a more risky approach, but actually a de-risking approach. And it's also showing to be performing equal or even better than traditional investments. So we do highlight that on the report. We didn't look into which CTFs are following responsible investments or not. Those out of scope, but I understand that the CTIS looking forward may start looking into the policies on responsible investment. So it might be something that the CTIS might track going forward. What we do have is 2 case studies, one on Fund Action, who has already been mentioned, who have their own mission related investment fund launched, and also on the coast funds, who have a fully mission aligned investment strategy, which would be interesting for people looking into this. I think in particular the coast funds that have a fully mission aligned strategy and how well they have performed consistently over the years would be, I think, a good place to start if you want to, for funds that want to look how fully a mission alignment could look like. I hope that answers your question. May I jump in?
Please, Natalia.
Just shortly, we've transitioned our whole investment portfolio to 100% sustainability, and the CFA was generous enough to share our case study. I'll be happy to elaborate if you're interested. This was something that we started 2 years ago, and we're very proud of the process. So that's why I had to intervene.
Excellent. Congratulations on that. No, it's, clearly the data are showing that socially responsible investing is a positive thing, and you're not really giving up returns if you do it well. So, so that's good to see. I have a question for maybe going out to Paquita and Amilcar. There's a lot of interest, of course, in private sector engagement. A question came up, we sort of addressed it, but I'm curious in terms of your assessment of the report and the sort of cases and situations where CTFs have effectively partnered with the private sector. Any additional sort of thoughts on that and how we can be more effective with our work with the private sector?
I think I'll look forward to Amilcar jumping in as well, but we're clearly not seeing the private sector stepping up in any way in terms of grants. And I think that there was a number of people who were kind of initially hoping that the private sector would be more of a philanthropic partner that way, and we're not seeing that happening. We are seeing a lot of new partnership opportunities where the private sector is willing to work with conservation trust funds on looking at more sustainable production processes, investing on their side on that. But the CTFs are using their innovative finance and their support from traditional donors to help fund their end for the most part. We're hoping that begins to shift, but that's what we were able to document in this report. The other area where we're going to be seeing a lot more private sector funding is in the compensation and mitigation realm. And so we discussed that quite a bit of how we expect that to be one of the major new financial mechanisms for the next 10 years.
Yeah, with all the money going into infrastructure investment and stuff like that, compensation could be huge.
Piece.
Yeah. Amilcar, did you want to add anything to that, or? Is that good?
No, just highlight that the case study of Fondo Acción has some very good examples of private sector collaboration, of course. And I think that was already mentioned partly by Viviana and I think Natalia as well. So I don't need to expand on that, I believe.
Great. Well, we're excellent. Thank you so much. We're winding down. I just want to, I'm going to maybe pass it back to Katie to remind us of the link to get to the document. And I think there's maybe some corrections we want to make before we'll repost that. But I just want to thank my panelists, Scott, Natalia, and Sean, and thank the authors and the task force and everyone that contributed to making this an amazing product. We're so proud, and thank the donors as well, you know, for being able to finance this. We are really thrilled by the product. We feel that, you know, as mentioned earlier, there's multiple conservation trust funds that are in development. This is a growing market and opportunity, and trust funds are just integrated into so many other conservation finance tools like project finance for permanence and you know, debt swaps and things like that. That this document just comes at a perfect time. And again, thanks everyone for you know, making such an amazing effort and producing such an astounding document. So congratulations to everyone. And Katie, I don't know if you want to close us off here. But over
Yes,
to you.
I just want to echo David's thanks to everybody who brought this together. It really has been an exciting process and a great outcome. And I also want to thank, we now have about 100 proofreaders. So we've basically outsourced proofreading. And we have had a few issues flagged for us. So we will fix those and have a new document up later this afternoon. So if you are thinking of sharing, please hold off for a couple hours until we have fixed a few glitches. And we thank everybody for your attention and for reading it. And yes, as David said, it's 200 something pages, so it'll make for good weekend reading. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks again, everyone, and have a great rest of your day, evening.
Absolutely.
Thank you all. It was
Bye, everyone.
Okay.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Bye.
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 Bye-bye. Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.